the opening of a shocking American case. The chilling saga begins with an atmosphere so charged it feels like history itself holds its breath. The United States, at the dawn of the 20th century, is a land of booming cities, roaring factories, and swirling tides of hopeful immigrants seeking the promise of a better life. The jazz-filled streets of New Orleans, vibrant, mysterious, alive with secrets, are the perfect stage for a story where light can quickly turn to darkness. Imagine the city as the sun dips below the Mississippi River, shadows lengthening and neighborhoods alive with new and old voices. There's an undercurrent of both celebration and anxiety, an edgy pulse in the city's veins as tales of crime and unrest float through the muggy night air. People are drawn to stoops and porches, sharing rumors about an unseen force, a malicious presence that seems both human and something more sinister. Nothing quite prepares the nation when, in May 1918, this shadow finally becomes flesh and blood. News of the attack thunders through newspapers, telegraphs, and the feverish chatter of the city's tight-knit blocks. This isn't just another crime story. It's the beginning of one of the most infamous unsolved murder sprees America will ever know. In hushed tones, Americans learn of a merciless intruder who slips unseen through the darkness, wielding nothing but the tools found in his victims' own homes. Rather than an outsider bringing exotic terror, this is a specter that twists the mundane, turning safety into vulnerability. The press gives him a name that would sit uneasily on the lips of the nation for generations: the Axeman of New Orleans. Unlike the typical urban legends, ghosts, ghouls, and folklore, this horror is tangible. Frustrated police, wringing their hands and fearing criticism from a terrified public, find themselves locked in a cat-and-mouse game with an assailant who seems to exist somewhere between myth and reality. Households, once bustling with laughter, are now hushed after dark, doors double-locked, axes and lanterns kept at the ready. Fear revives old suspicions and creates new divides. What truly sets this case apart, and what makes its opening so notorious, is not simply the killings themselves, but the gravity with which it grips an entire city, then the whole country. The Axeman embodies the anxieties of an era: distrust of outsiders, uncertainty in new urban landscapes, and the terrible realization that sometimes, evil walks among us. His first strike is not just a murder, it's a jolt of electricity through the American psyche, rendering sleep uneasy and every unfamiliar noise suspect. From the very first page, the city of New Orleans is cast as both victim and stage, the rest of America trembling in empathy and fascination. And in those feverish first days, nobody can guess just how deep the darkness will run. Context of the United States in the early 20th century. Setting the stage at the dawn of the 20th century, America was a nation of dizzying contrasts and opportunity, shaped by waves of change that swept through every bustling city and remote countryside. The United States, only decades removed from its Civil War, stood confidently at the threshold of modernity. Skyscrapers clawed at the skies in New York and Chicago. Steam locomotives roared across the heartland, stitching the continent together, while automobiles began appearing on muddy roads, signaling the coming technological revolution. Society itself was churning, restless with ambition and anxiety. Immigration reached its peak, with millions arriving on America's shores each year. Italians, Irish, Germans, Jews, Poles, Chinese, each group forming new enclaves, bringing their traditions, languages, and dreams. Cities became patchworks of these vibrant communities, thriving but often living in uneasy tension with each other and with the older guard of American society. Urban neighborhoods teemed with the din of commerce by day and the mysteries of nightfall, their narrow streets lit by gas lamps and the distant glow of neon. New Orleans in particular had grown into a city unlike any other. Perched on the banks of the mighty Mississippi, it was a cultural gumbo, a fusion of French, Spanish, African, and American influences, with a population as colorful and unpredictable as the city's legendary Mardi Gras parades. Jazz was rising from smoky bars and front porches, mingling in the humid air with the spicy aroma of Creole cooking. The French Quarter buzzed late into the night, attracting socialites, gamblers, and the lost souls of the South. Yet beneath its festive skin, New Orleans carried an undercurrent of unease, a city haunted by its history of slavery, bruised by race riots, and often rocked by political corruption and economic hardship. It was also an era marked by startling contrasts in technology and living standards. While the rich adorned their grand homes with electricity and telephones, many poorer Americans still relied on candlelight and fetched water from pumps in communal yards. The divides between classes, and even within immigrant communities, were stark, and suspicion was a constant companion to opportunity. Crime, petty, organized, and sometimes shockingly violent, was a fact of urban life, giving rise to legends and urban myths that swept through the gossip networks faster than any newspaper headline. Within this dynamic but fragile world, the seeds of paranoia and dread could easily take root. The ever-present fear of disease like yellow fever or influenza, mingled with anxieties about job security, political radicalism, and the unknown motivations of one's neighbors, especially if they did not speak your language or share your heritage. Law enforcement was often rudimentary and overwhelmed, giving both protection and punishment in erratic measure. Justice, when it came, could be slow and arbitrary, and the poor or foreign-born were most often its victims. This volatile brew set the perfect stage for a series of crimes so heinous and inexplicable that they would come to define an entire era of American darkness. Such was the backdrop into which the Axeman slashed, a time when hope thrived in daylight and fear took dominion at night, and the line between civilization and savagery seemed in retrospect perilously thin. The axe becomes a spell. The axe, such an ordinary hard-working tool of early 20th century America, transformed overnight from an object of everyday utility into a symbol of pure terror in New Orleans. In the hands of the mysterious Axeman, it became something almost mythic, a cursed object whispered about on stoops and behind shop counters in 1,000 anxious voices. People had once chopped firewood and repaired rooftops with these sturdy instruments, but now, just the sight of a well-worn axe leaning by a back door could dry the mouth of even the bravest soul. What stupefied the public most wasn't just the violence or the stealth of the killer, but the perverse intimacy of his methods. The Axeman did not bring some exotic foreign weapon. He scouted the homes that slept so trustingly in the humid nights and selected his weapon from the tools already there, an axe left by the woodpile, a straight razor at a shaving table. He used what was familiar, mutating symbols of safety into icons of dread. Each attack seemed less like a random act and more like a calculated ritual, as if the very objects of American domesticity were being corrupted at their roots. Every family with a back porch or a garden shed found something to fear in their own home: a knife misplaced, a shadowy figure glimpsed by the woodshed, a tool not where it had always been. Neighbors whispered rumors, wondering aloud if these axes were cursed from the start, or if the hands that wielded them were guided by something unholy. Children were warned to stay away from the tool sheds, and grown men would flinch at hearing the faintest clatter outside after dark. Even the police, when walking through blood-slick kitchens and trampled vegetable patches at crime scenes, reported a chill running down their spines as they bagged up those common implements that had suddenly been transformed into evidence of unspeakable evil. The city's hardware stores saw axes flying off the shelves purchased by terrified citizens, but as defensive totems, not tools. Ironically, the same brand and make could be seen in 100 doorways, a reminder that nobody was safe, and that evil did not come from without, but was lurking in the most mundane corners of their lives. The transformation of the axe into a curse was as much psychological as physical. Newspapers printed lurid headlines, and the public consumed obsessive details about the make, the weight, the very grain of wood in the murder weapons, as if understanding their construction could offer any protection. In a city already accustomed to superstition, jazz, and ghost stories, this real-life nightmare seeped quickly into legend. The axe had become a bloody echo, a curse cast over every household, a warning that even the tools you trust could one day turn against you. The first horrific case, 1918. In the heavy, humid darkness before dawn on May 23, 1918, New Orleans was jolted from its uneasy sleep by a scream, raw, terrified, and entirely unmistakable. The sound emanated from the modest home and grocery store of Joseph Maggio, located on a quiet intersection in a neighborhood thick with the sense of baking bread, strong coffee, and the distant echo of jazz. Joseph and his wife Catherine, both proud Italian-Americans, were fixtures of the local community, hard-working, friendly faces whose lives seemed woven into the patchwork of New Orleans itself. That Thursday morning, it was Joseph's younger brother Andrew who first heard the horror. Andrew, who lived next door and was already on edge due to rumblings of unrest and stories of petty crime in the city, was suddenly alert as the night's silence shattered. He quickly roused his youngest brother, grabbed whatever could be used in defense and rushed to Joseph's house, fear and dread rising with each step. They arrived to find the front door eerily silent and locked. Circling to the back, their worst fears were realized when they discovered the door hanging slightly ajar, the frame splintered and a board crudely pried loose in the lower corner, ominous evidence of forced entry. Inside, the home was steeped in an unnatural quiet, broken only by their anxious footfalls on the creaking floorboards. Even in the dim light, the scene in the cramped bedroom was enough to freeze their blood. Catherine lay sprawled and lifeless, her nightgown stained with deep crimson. Joseph barely clung to life beside her, his breath wet and shallow, blood pooling beneath him. The small room was a tableau of brutality. Blood painted the sheets, the walls, and even the family's few pieces of cherished furniture. The weapon lay close by, a heavy axe glistening slick and wicked in the half-light, a commonplace tool transformed into an object of evil. Nearby, a straight razor, its blade smeared with gore, offered mute testimony to the violence wrought inside those walls. Notably, the killer had chosen to use the blunt side of the axe, as if to amplify the suffering and chaos inflicted. Panic now leapt through the neighborhood. The brothers immediately ran to the local police, who rushed to the scene. Upon arrival, officers and detectives alike were staggered not only by the carnage but by the eerie precision and silence with which it had been carried out. No valuables stolen, no ransacking, only death left in the perpetrator's wake. Joseph died before sunrise, joining his wife as the first victims of what was soon to become an infamous chain of horror. Investigators, scouring the violent tableau for answers, were struck by both the brutality and the killer's calculated ease. A bloodied set of clothing was found, apparently the murderer's own discard, suggesting he'd cleaned up and simply vanished into the night. The only apparent point of entry was the pried board at the rear door, and both the axe and the razor were household items belonging to the Maggios. It appeared the killer had simply slipped in, used what he found, and slipped back out again, leaving no trace but devastation. Near the scene, detectives happened upon a chilling message scrawled in chalk on the wall. "Mrs. Maggio will sit up tonight, just like Mrs. Tony." This reference sent tremors through law enforcement and the small Italian grocer community alike, as Mrs. Tony had been the victim of a violent attack years earlier, raising the specter that a serial madman, fueled by some unknown vendetta, had returned to haunt the city anew. Within hours, the once familiar air of the neighborhood turned oppressive, every flicker of shadow now an omen. Doors were double-bolted, axes and knives put under lock and key, neighbors suspecting neighbors and rumors breeding faster than the official investigation could move. The Maggio murders marked the opening of a new era of terror for New Orleans, the first signature of the Axeman, whose reign would grip the city in its icy hands and refuse to let go. Chain haunting, fear spreading. As the horrifying details of the Axeman's first attack seeped into the consciousness of New Orleans and beyond, fear began to radiate in waves throughout the city, like the ripples caused by a stone dropped in still water. Word spread quickly, first through frantic whispers among neighbors, then by the blaring headlines of local newspapers, and soon via telegraph, trains, and post, to the rest of America. The very fabric of daily life began to unravel. The sense of safety that had once been taken for granted evaporated almost overnight. Families who once left doors unlocked in the sultry southern evenings now began to double, even triple lock every entrance. Housewives hid axes and kitchen knives, parents warned their children not to venture out after dark, and shopkeepers eyed every unfamiliar face with apprehension. Reports began to swell of mysterious figures, seen darting through alleyways, of odd noises in the night, and of household pets who became restless and agitated after sundown. It felt as though the city itself was bracing for another storm, and every shadow took on a sinister potential. Police struggled to contain not just the threat itself, but the wild rumors that blossomed in its wake, stories of supernatural evildoers, vigilante justice, and even whispers of vengeful ghosts or ancient curses. Some believed the Axeman was no mere criminal but a spirit of retribution. Fear grew into mass paranoia. Gun and hardware stores experienced record sales as citizens rushed to purchase any means of defense. Hardware merchants noted that axes ironically became the most sought-after item, but now for the purpose of self-protection rather than utility. For New Orleans' Italian immigrant community, who comprised many of the victims, the climate of suspicion was even more suffocating. Neighbors eyed one another uneasily, old feuds reignited, and the police, already under immense pressure, conducted sweeping, often arbitrary interrogations. Some innocent men were detained, their reputations bruised beyond repair, only to be released for lack of evidence. In these tense weeks, mistrust, finger-pointing and xenophobia festered alongside real terror. Newspapers stoked the flames, publishing lurid accounts and speculative theories, sometimes naming suspects long before the facts could bear them out. Each new edition was devoured with a mixture of dread and morbid curiosity. Sensational headlines pushed anxiety to fever pitch: "Death stalks the Crescent City," "Ghostly axe murderer still at large," and "Can anyone be safe?" Children lay awake at night, convinced that every creak and groan of the old family homes signaled the approach of doom. Grown men sat up, lanterns at the ready, waiting for a menace that never showed, though they never entirely stopped believing he might. What began as an isolated tragedy became a rolling wave of panic that swept through New Orleans and threatened to subsume all hope with suspicion and fear. The chilling chain reaction was set. Every echoing report of new violence only deepened the sense that the Axeman was always one step ahead, and that no home, no matter how modest or grand, was truly secure. The next victims: a merciless death trap. As New Orleans staggered under the shock of the Maggio murders, the city's fragile sense of normalcy splintered with horrifying speed. It wasn't long before the Axeman struck again, this time sending ripples of dread not only through the tight-knit Italian neighborhoods, but across every class and ethnicity in the city. The pattern of the attacks grew clearer, and yet no less baffling. In June 1918, a small grocery store just a few blocks from the first crime scene became the setting for a new act of violence. The proprietor and his companion were discovered, bloodied and barely alive, the shop's familiar aisles now tainted with the metallic tang of blood and panic. As investigators arrived, they realized with a chilling sense of déjà vu that nothing valuable had been taken, and the weapon, a heavy axe, had once again been lifted from the victim's own storeroom. Everyone knew now: no business, no home, no family was safe. The Axeman's choice of targets appeared random on the surface but bred a whispering paranoia in the city's immigrant communities. Singled out were Italian-American shopkeepers and their families, an echo of both the city's commercial rivalries and its deepest prejudices. Some muttered about vendettas imported from the old country, others pointed to jealous business competitors, but most simply locked their shutters tighter and slept with every light burning. The unrelenting nature of the attacks pushed fear to new heights. Each fresh victim was not just a tragedy but a warning, proof that the killer was undeterred by the growing police presence or the anxious eyes peering from behind every lace curtain. On steamy summer nights, the city's winding streets felt more like a labyrinth where every shadow concealed danger, every neighbor a possible suspect. Rumors twisted through the tenements. People spoke of mysterious letters written in fractured English and Italian, brimming with threats and cryptic references. Some even claimed the Axeman sent warnings to his intended victims, mocking their helplessness. For survivors, the aftermath was unsparing. Victims battered nearly beyond recognition would wake in hospital beds, unable to recall any detail beyond the sudden, blinding fear. To lose a loved one to the Axeman was to be thrust into a nightmare that did not end with daybreak, a grief compounded by the city's hunger for details, by reporters loitering at the door, by neighbors quick to theorize and to shun. The city's most vulnerable citizens shouldered the greatest weight. Some families packed up and disappeared overnight, their shops shuttered, hopes abandoned. Others stayed, trying to outlast the specter that haunted their streets. If the first crime had laid bare the city's fragility, each subsequent attack revealed how quickly fear could become a trap of its own. The deadliest kind, one fashioned not from wood or steel, but from suspicion and despair. Doubts and conflicts in the immigrant community. In the aftermath of the Axeman's brutal attacks, suspicion and conflict began to fester within the immigrant enclaves of New Orleans, igniting old rivalries and birthing new ones out of the thick fog of fear. The city's Italian-American community, already viewed by some locals with wariness due to their unfamiliar customs and tight-knit networks, became the reluctant epicenter of this swirling anxiety. Each new murder further deepened a sense of alienation, both from the native New Orleanians and within the various factions of the immigrant population itself. In grocery stores and parish halls, behind closed doors and in hushed gatherings, the question hung on every tongue: was the killer an outsider hell-bent on terrorizing the vulnerable? Or worse, was he one of their own, jealous over business, hiding among them, observing their every move? Ancient feuds and simmering resentments, brought over on steamers from Sicily, Naples, or Calabria, erupted anew. Rumors flourished, tales of mafia vendettas, shadowy groups settling scores the law could not. Trust, that most fragile of commodities, evaporated between neighbors who yesterday had shared bread and stories. Children, hearing snatches of gossip from fearful parents, began to point fingers at classmates whose families had once quarreled with their own. Local police, frustrated by their inability to solve the murders, often responded by rounding up swaths of Italian men for questioning on the thinnest pretext. These heavy-handed tactics only deepened the sense of victimization and injustice, stirring outrage among law-abiding families who already felt singled out and misunderstood. For the broader immigrant population, Irish, German, Jewish, and African American as well, paranoia bled across community lines. The Axeman's anonymity became a weapon more powerful than his axe, uniting everyone in terror but splintering them in mistrust. Some Italian business owners withdrew from public life, boards nailed over shop windows, while others insisted loudly on their innocence, railing against both the murderer and the suspicion contaminating their neighborhoods. Meanwhile, the city's newspapers played eager accomplice to the hysteria, splashing lurid headlines and publishing speculative editorials about foreign feuds and violent traditions imported from the Old World. Their words stoked fires already burning in the streets, sometimes suggesting that the brutality at hand was somehow inherent to the recent arrivals, furthering a narrative that justified both social distance and police crackdowns. So desperate was the atmosphere that informal vigilante groups began to form. Neighborhood watches patrolled the streets, some motivated by genuine fear, others by darker resentments or a thirst for rough justice. Innocent men were accused, sometimes attacked, reputations built over decades withered in a matter of weeks. The greater New Orleans community, once a patchwork of cautiously shared dreams, now found itself divided by invisible lines scarred deep by suspicion. The continuing nightmare, and the classic threatening letter. As the city reeled under the relentless shadow of the Axeman, the nightmare only grew more intense, taking on new and even more bizarre dimensions that embroiled every corner of New Orleans. The murders, once chilling enough, began to be accompanied by a new kind of terror, one that manifested not just in sudden violence, but in psychological warfare. This period marked the escalation from physical danger into the realm of the grotesque and the surreal, a swirling feverish state in which rumor, fear, and anticipation wove together into something almost supernatural. In March of 1919, the case took a wild, unforgettable turn that would not only cement its place in the annals of true crime, but also stitch it indelibly into American folklore. Out of nowhere, the offices of the New Orleans Times-Picayune received a letter purportedly from the Axeman himself. The letter was written in broken English, yet it was laced with a fiendish eloquence that unnerved even the most skeptical journalists. The writer declared himself to be no mere mortal, but a demon straight from the hottest pits of Hades, promising that on the following Tuesday night he would prowl the city, sparing only those households in which live jazz music was playing. Word of the letter spread like wildfire. Panic mixed with disbelief, then morphed into something far stranger, a kind of grotesque excitement. New Orleans, already a city of music, now became a trembling orchestra. Jazz bands were hastily assembled. Restaurants, dance halls, and private homes filled the muggy night air with trumpet, clarinet, and drum, all in hopes of warding off the demon with melody. That night, now legendary, no house, no corner, no saloon seemed silent. Even those who scoffed at the threat, perhaps privately, could not help but ensure not a single sour note would risk their lives. The city was overtaken by a strange, frenetic unity, a shared will to survive that masqueraded as revelry. Miraculously, as dawn broke, there were no new reports of violence. The Axeman's curse, at least for one night, was powerless against the music. Yet, this bizarre event did far more than just avert bloodshed. It reshaped the city's sense of itself. The bizarre letter, an intersection of threat, performance, and urban legend, brought people of all backgrounds together, united under the threat of an unnatural evil. Simultaneously, it deepened the psychological hold the Axeman exerted over the communal mind. Was his threat real? Was it a sick prank, an opportunistic copycat, or the rambling of a true madman? None could say, but all felt its grip. For many, the jazz night became not just a singular survival story, but an emblem of the city's spirit, resourceful, resilient, and creative, even in the face of death. Newspapers across the country reported on the extraordinary evening, turning the Axeman into a creature as much of the media as of the shadows. Yet the fear did not subside. If anything, it grew. The killer's ability to manipulate not only bodies but hearts and minds meant that no one person, however distant from the original murders, could consider themselves immune from the terror. The last attacks and the unending obsession. In the smoldering aftermath of the infamous jazz night, the Axeman did not fade into silence as the city might have hoped. Instead, a chilling pattern of attacks continued, though at less frequent intervals, stretching the nerves of New Orleans taut. Each new assault reminded citizens that the nightmare was far from over. The murders grew less predictable, targeting Italian grocers and their families with an almost mechanical ruthlessness. These final attacks, occurring from late 1919 into the early months of 1920, felt like the malignant echoes of a melody the city could not stop hearing. For the victims, there was rarely warning. Families who had survived the initial terror years kept implements locked away and vigilantes at hand, but the Axeman, elusive as a ghost, always managed to breach their makeshift defenses. Windows and doors were smashed, boards pried loose, and once again, tools of honest labor became the instruments of madness. Scenes at each crime gave investigators an infuriating déjà vu: blood-spattering grocery aisles, personal items untouched, valuables left in plain sight as if to mock the idea of motive. Each new murder sent deeper tremors through the city. Panic sharpened into exhausted dread. Once hopeful immigrants now saw their neighborhoods half deserted, with shuttered shops and families fleeing before dusk. Police patrols blanketed the Italian districts, questions and accusations circulated with a venomous undertone, but all efforts yielded nothing but frustration. The Axeman had become a phantom, and citizens came to dread even the softest nighttime sound for fear that it signaled his return. Meanwhile, the press dredged new theories and old suspicions. Some whispered of occult ritual, others of organized crime, while more desperate voices wondered if the city itself wasn't somehow cursed. The killer's mysterious hiatuses between attacks ignited speculation. Had he moved on, been imprisoned for another crime? Or was he simply biding his time, lurking in plain sight? The uncertainty became a second, subtler form of torment. Families grieved behind blackout curtains, haunted by nightmares, with even survivors doubting their own stories in the gray hours before dawn. By early autumn of 1919, the attacks abated as abruptly as they had begun. The city exhaled cautiously, waiting for the axe to fall once more, but no further murders were ever definitively attributed to the Axeman. Slowly, people began to reclaim the streets and their routines, yet the sense of violated trust, the lingering specter of evil, remained imprinted on the city's soul. For years, stories of his final victims circulated in barrooms and on stoops, the names and details growing distorted by fear. The legend was complete. The Axeman had slipped away, his shadow eternal, and New Orleans's nights would never entirely belong to the living again. Hypothesis about the perpetrator and a big question. Mark's speculation and wild theories quickly became inexorable companions to the fear that gripped New Orleans. From the earliest days of the Axeman's reign of terror, investigators, journalists, and frightened citizens spun countless hypotheses in an attempt to explain the inexplicable. Who could move so easily through the city, strike with such precision, and vanish without a trace again and again? The enduring mystery surrounding the killer's identity has outlived the crimes themselves, casting a persistent shadow over the city's collective memory. One of the most popular theories, whispered in back rooms and blared in newspaper headlines, was that the Axeman might be connected to the Italian Mafia, or La Cosa Nostra as it was sometimes called. Some believed he was sent as a hitman to punish or intimidate grocers who had refused to pay protection money. Others theorized that the killings were motivated by vendettas smuggled across the ocean, part of secret scores carried from Italy to America. Yet no concrete evidence ever surfaced to support these mafia tales, and survivors and families often denied any involvement in criminal activities. Still, the idea persisted, fueled by the city's love of sensationalism and a long-standing distrust of outsiders. Not all believed the Axeman to be a lone wolf or an organized criminal. Tireless investigators latched onto alternative suspects, a disgruntled butcher skilled with blades, a madman drawn to the shadows, or even a former patient of the city's infamous asylums. Sketchy sightings and reports of suspicious strangers poured in by the dozen tall men seen lurking near groceries at dusk, itinerant workers passing through the city, or jilted lovers with scores to settle. None of these leads ever stuck, and more often they led to innocent men being detained, questioned, and ultimately released. The lack of motive, the randomness of the crimes, and the killer's uncanny ability to disappear left authorities in a state of near constant frustration. Some more imaginative or superstitious locals even floated ideas bordering on the paranormal. Stories were passed around that the Axeman was not entirely human, but some kind of devil incarnate. These tales, whispered late at night on quiet stoops, drew from the eeriness with which he entered homes undetected, and his chilling taunts via the infamous letter. Some residents were convinced the Axeman was a restless spirit, or a demon with a taste for blood, feeding on the city's collective fear. Jazz, they mused, was the only thing powerful enough to keep him at bay, lending otherworldly credence to the night the murders ceased in song. The sudden end of the killing spree deepened the mystery. The crimes stopped almost as abruptly as they started, leaving investigators, journalists, and everyday citizens to ponder what had changed. Had the Axeman been killed in an unrelated altercation? Did he flee New Orleans for another city to begin anew? Was he locked away for another crime, his connection never made? Or had he simply tired of his dark game after casting the city into turmoil? The police files remained maddeningly thin, and no one was ever arrested or publicly named as the Axeman. Unlike many famous American murderers, his story did not end in a courtroom but in a cloud of speculation. Modern true crime enthusiasts and criminologists have re-examined the Axeman case, scouring what scant evidence remains, the methods of entry, the chosen weapons, the strange ritualistic elements, and the almost exclusive targeting of Italian grocers and their families. Some believe these patterns point to a killer operating with a personal or ethnic grudge, while others see a more random, impulsive violence. Contemporary profiling techniques unavailable to early 20th century police offer intriguing theories. A sociopath or opportunist with deep psychological wounds, perhaps triggered by personal loss or humiliation. Yet, in the end, all theories remain tantalizingly out of reach. The Axeman slipped away into legend, a name without a face, an evil without an origin. Every generation of New Orleanians revisits the case, hoping for a breakthrough, or simply to marvel with morbid fascination at the darkness that once doorstepped their city. The question of who done it is never far from the city's mind, a riddle that lingers in jazz melodies, shadowy corners, and every story told while lamps flicker late into the Louisiana night. Influence on popular culture. The chilling saga of the Axeman's rampage didn't just fade into the annals of unsolved crime, it evolved, growing more formidable as it bled into every crevice of American popular culture. Over a century since the murders, the shadow of the Axeman still lingers, echoing through media, music, art, and literary circles as both a warning and a macabre muse. In the world of true crime, his legend is foundational. Dozens of books, documentaries, and podcasts meticulously dissect the timeline of his atrocities, always circling back to the unanswered questions that gnaw at the curious and the fearful alike. For many authors and amateur sleuths, the Axeman is less a historical figure than a captivating enigma, a blank canvas upon which storytellers graft their own fears and fascinations. This magnetic pull is evident in the parade of novels and short stories that draw inspiration from the panic he inspired. Whether in gritty detective fiction or supernatural thrillers, he plays the role of the unstoppable specter, the embodiment of terror that stalks quiet neighborhoods and fragile psyches. Television and film, too, have seized upon his dark charisma. The infamous letter that threatened the city with murder, unless homes were filled with jazz, has become a pop culture touchstone. It was immortalized in the popular TV anthology American Horror Story Coven, where the Axeman is resurrected as a jazz-loving, otherworldly killer, blending historical details with a feverish sense of gothic horror. This episode, in turn, introduced a new generation to the myth, spiking renewed interest in the century-old crimes and prompting late-night internet rabbit holes for countless curious fans. Music, especially jazz, plays a fascinating double role in the Axeman's mythos. New Orleans, already renowned for its homegrown sound, found the legend of the killer who spared those who played jazz an irresistible tale. Several jazz musicians and songwriters have repurposed the story, weaving lyrics or motifs that reference the Axeman's warning into their work, sometimes as dark comedy, sometimes as a celebration of the city's unbreakable spirit in the face of danger. Even now, themed jazz nights and parodic performances recall that surreal evening when music was believed to ward off evil. Beyond the world of direct adaptation, the Axeman has become symbolic, an archetype for urban legend and the faceless evil lurking on the margins of society. Comic books have reimagined him as a shadowy nemesis, Urban exploration forums trade ghost stories in which his spirit haunts crumbling New Orleans buildings. Artists exploring themes of fear, paranoia, and the unknown are drawn again and again to the motif of the axe, or its ominous absence when depicting the city's darker history. The true cultural legacy, however, resides in the way the Axeman story has shaped broader conversations about crime, fear, and community identity. Classroom debates, academic studies, and public history projects invoke the case to explore the psychology of mass fear, the role of media in amplifying panic, and the resilience of neighborhoods beleaguered by loss. The legend also prompts introspection. How do communities remember their traumas? Why are we so fascinated still by the monsters in our own backyards? In New Orleans itself, the Axeman has become entwined with local folklore, spoken about as both boogeyman and cautionary tale. Ghost tours feature his story as a highlight, neighborhoods whisper of his specter on humid nights, and every so often the haunting notes of jazz ringing through the city's streets recall a time when music felt like the only weapon against the darkness. In the end, the Axeman endures, not just as an unsolved crime, but as a character whose chilling legacy lives on, daring each new generation to look into the shadows and wonder what they'll find there. Result: the mystery remains in the darkness of night. In the end, the case of the Axeman of New Orleans stands as one of the most haunting enigmas in American criminal history, a story whose echoes have never truly faded. For decades, the story has lingered at the margins of folklore and memory, its shadow stretching over generations that never knew the fear firsthand, but nevertheless learned to whisper the Axeman's name after dark. The unanswered questions, the unclaimed motives, and the facelessness of the perpetrator spark debate each time they resurface, as if daring another era to uncover the truth that eluded all before it. No official resolution ever came. Suspects slipped in and out of the police's grasp. Tantalizing clues led nowhere. Even years after the attack ceased, the city of New Orleans continued to vibrate with quiet anxiety, a subtle suggestion that whatever evil had visited might one day return. Survivors and their families struggled with the enormity of what had happened, their trauma passing quietly from parent to child. In the passage of time, what might have become just another entry in the annals of unsolved crimes instead transformed into a living legend. What endures is not simply the horrifying violence or the sense of injustice at a case left cold, but the atmosphere the Axeman conjured. He became a figure hovering between reality and myth, a story that stands for all the darkness we cannot fully name or drive away. The Axeman's legacy is as much psychological as historical, a demonstration of how terror, once unleashed, can infiltrate culture, identity, and memory so thoroughly that it becomes part of a place's soul. New Orleans, with all its layering of music and mystery, still bears the scar, a mysterious, uneasy tune occasionally rising whenever the city remembers its brush with pure, motiveless evil. Perhaps it is the very lack of answers that keeps the legend alive. In a world where so many stories eventually resolve, the Axeman case is a chilling exception, a reminder that some shadows never yield to light, and that every city, however lively, harbors its share of mysteries that will never be solved. To this day, the case of the Axeman of New Orleans remains unsolved, leaving behind not only lingering questions about the killer's motives and identity, but also about the very nature of fear and evil within each person. Was he a deranged madman, a cold-blooded murderer, or a demon disguised as a human? The city of New Orleans is forever marked by this wound in its history.